Case 1. Judy Buenoano. This is the deeply unsettling account of a Florida woman who turned the people closest to her into silent targets and collected financially every single time one of them disappeared from this world. What makes her story unlike almost any other is how long it went completely undetected, and the fact that it only unraveled because one of her targets happened to survive. Judy Buenoano was approximately 41 years old at the time of her first conviction for crimes she began committing when she was in her late 20s. Her victims included her own husband, a U.S. Air Force veteran named James Goodyear, who died in an Orlando hospital on September 16, 1971, while the world around him called it illness. The attending physicians at the U.S. Naval Hospital in Orlando listed the cause of her husband's death as organ failure and pulmonary complications, and because he passed in a supervised medical setting, no toxicology examination was ordered. Judy Buenoano accepted the condolences, signed the paperwork, collected approximately $33,000 in life insurance, plus additional funds from the Veterans Administration, and opened a business. But it didn't end there. The horror of this story was just beginning. Judy Buenoano's own son was also among those she targeted. That detail alone tells you the kind of case this is, and the investigation that would eventually link her name to all the crimes she committed was more than a decade away. We ranked Judy Buenoano at number 1 on this list because she became the first woman Florida executed in over 150 years, and no case on this list better represents the terrifying combination of patience, proximity, and calculated harm. What was truly driving Judy Buenoano all along? Let's jump into the details of this case. She had been born Judias Welty on April 4, 1943, into a household that offered very little stability. Her early years included time in foster care, and she was still a teenager when she gave birth to her first child, a son she named Michael, raising him largely without support before marrying James Goodyear in the early 1960s. James Goodyear adopted Michael. Together they had 2 more children, James Jr. and Kimberly. Judy worked as a nurse's aide and eventually built a presence in the local business community. Nothing about the surface of her life signaled anything unusual. Prosecutors would later argue that this was always the point. The ordinary appearance of her life was precisely what gave her cover. After James Goodyear's death, she changed her surname to Buenoano, a loose Spanish rendering of the phrase meaning good year. She shared a home for a period with a man named Bobby Joe Morris, who died in Colorado in 1978 under circumstances that drew suspicion. Arsenic poisoning was suspected, but never prosecuted. She collected on his life insurance policy. She filed claims related to alleged fires and thefts at various points. A pattern was forming, though the people who might have seen it were not yet in a position to assemble it. Her son Michael enlisted in the U.S. Army in 1979. Almost immediately, he began experiencing a frightening physical decline, severe weakness, loss of coordination, deterioration that left physicians without a clear explanation. By 1980, he had received a medical discharge and was dependent on heavy metal braces fitted to his arms and legs. He was 19 years old and could not move through the world without assistance.
On May 13, 1980, he and his mother went out on a canoe on the East River near Navarre. The canoe capsized. Michael, wearing no life jacket and encumbered by braces he could not remove in the water, went under. He did not come back up. Investigators ruled it an accidental drowning. The life insurance was processed and paid. 3 years later, Buenoano was in a serious relationship with a Pensacola businessman named John Gentry. She persuaded him to take out a life insurance policy reportedly valued near $500,000, naming her as the primary beneficiary. She gave him vitamin capsules as a regular part of their routine. He grew seriously ill. He was hospitalized, recovered, and then one evening in Pensacola, the vehicle he walked toward exploded in a parking lot. John Gentry survived. When investigators searched Buenoano's home, they found materials consistent with the device. What had begun as a single attempted murder case rapidly became the lever that pulled open everything beneath it. Court-ordered exhumations of James Goodyear and Bobby Joe Morris produced findings that earlier examinations had never generated. Both men showed evidence of chronic arsenic exposure. The progression of Michael's physical decline before his death on the water matched that same picture precisely. Insurance documents traced a consistent trail. policies taken out on the people closest to her, each followed by a death or near death and a payout. In 1984, a jury convicted her of the first-degree murder of Michael and the attempted murder of John Gentry. She received a life sentence for the first charge and 12 years for the second. A separate trial in 1985, focused on the death of James Goodyear, returned the same verdict, and this time the sentence was death. More than 20 separate legal challenges followed in the post-conviction years, covering everything from the reliability of exhumation-gathered arsenic evidence to the use of uncharged conduct during the penalty phase. The Florida Supreme Court reviewed the case comprehensively and affirmed both the conviction and the death sentence in 1988. Clemency was denied the following year. Later appeals challenging Florida's execution method were also denied. On March 30, 1998, at Florida State Prison in Rayford, Judy Buenoano was executed at the age of 54. She was the first woman put to death in Florida since 1848, and only the third woman executed in the United States since capital punishment was reinstated in 1977. Witnesses present reported that she appeared overcome with fear as she was brought into the execution chamber. She left no final statement. She had maintained a claim of innocence through every stage of the proceedings and into her final moments. What the Buenoano case asks of anyone who looks at it carefully is a question with no clean answer. How does something like this remain invisible for so long? Each death, taken individually, appeared to be misfortune. A soldier too ill to recover from what war had done to him. A young man who fell from a canoe. A boyfriend who died unexpectedly. It was only when every policy, every payout, and every name on the list were laid side by side that the shape of it became impossible to deny. James Goodyear came home from Vietnam and never made it to another Florida autumn. Michael Buenoano was 19 years old and never had the chance to become who he might have been. And John Gentry, who walked away from an exploding car in a Pensacola parking lot, is the reason anyone knows their names at all. If you enjoy videos like this, please remember to like this video and subscribe to our channel.
Case 2. Christine Falling. This is the haunting account of a teenage girl from North Florida who was invited into family homes to care for young children, and whose presence in those homes ended in death again and again before anyone in authority decided to look at the full picture. What made this case so slow to be exposed is almost as disturbing as the crimes themselves. There is a particular kind of trust that small communities extend almost without examining it. The trust placed in the teenage girl from down the street, the one who comes over when a family needs someone to watch the children for a few hours. It is not trust built from credentials or evidence. It is trust built from proximity, from familiarity, from the assumption, so rarely questioned, that the person sitting with the youngest members of the household poses no danger to them. In the small towns of North Florida in the early 1980s, a young woman named Christine Falling lived inside that trust. She relied on it, and over the course of roughly 2 years, several children placed in her care did not survive the experience. The communities around her attributed the losses to bad luck, to illness, to the inexplicable tragedies that sometimes visit families. They were wrong. She was 19 years old at the time of her conviction for crimes she committed between the ages of 17 and 19. Her victims were infants and toddlers, children placed in her care who had no ability to protect themselves. The death that finally opened the investigation involved 10-week-old Travis Coleman, who died on July 2, 1982, in Blountstown, Florida. Before that, multiple children had already died, and each time the world found another explanation. We ranked Christine Falling at number 2 because the vulnerability of every single victim and the number of losses dismissed before anyone looked closely represents a failure on multiple levels that this case forces us to examine. What was Christine Falling really doing in those homes? Let's find out. Christine Laverne Falling was born on March 12, 1963, in Perry, Florida. Her earliest years were shaped by domestic instability. Her parents' relationship involved documented violence, and police were called to the home repeatedly. By the time she was 9, she and her sister had been removed from the family and placed in foster care. She suffered from epilepsy requiring ongoing medication and was described as having intellectual limitations, though no consistent formal evaluation was ever conducted during her childhood. At the age of 14, she married a man considerably older than herself, a brief and volatile union that ended poorly. Afterward, she developed a pattern of frequent hospital visits, presenting with complaints, unexplained spots, bleeding, unusual pains that medical staff could rarely identify as genuine conditions. Some accounts note she averaged nearly one hospital visit every 2 weeks during this period, presenting as someone perpetually unwell in ways that never quite resolved. When Falling began babysitting in communities around Blountstown and Perry, she was a teenager in genuine need of income, and families were willing to hire her. The first death associated with her care occurred on February 22, 1980. 2-year-old Cassidy Johnson, whom her family called Muffin, became unresponsive while in Falling's care and died 3 days later in the hospital. Investigators noted inconsistencies but could not definitively establish a cause. Suspicion was raised, written into reports, and then quietly set aside. The community moved forward. In Lakeland, in 1981, a 4-year-old boy named Jeffrey Davis stopped breathing while Falling watched him.
He died. On the day of Jeffrey's funeral, she was asked to care for his 2-year-old cousin, Joseph Spring. That child died during what appeared to be a nap. Medical examiners attributed one death to myocarditis and the other to a viral infection. The same person had been present at the moment each child stopped breathing. The record noted it. The investigation did not follow through. In July of 1981, 8-month-old Jennifer Daniels was left briefly in Falling's care while her mother stepped out. When the mother returned, the infant was unresponsive. Jennifer Daniels died. Falling would later confess to placing her hands over the child's face until she lost consciousness. At the time, the death was not classified as a homicide, and the case did not produce an arrest. The investigation that finally broke the pattern open came from the death of 10-week-old Travis Coleman on July 2, 1982, in Blountstown. Travis died while in Falling's care. The autopsy that followed revealed internal findings inconsistent with natural causes, pointing clearly towards suffocation. Investigators now had forensic grounds to look at every prior death as a connected series rather than a sequence of tragedies. Falling was arrested. In subsequent conversations with law enforcement and mental health professionals, she did not deny what had happened. She described hearing voices that commanded her to silence the children, and she described the method she had used in terms that communicated both awareness of her actions and a troubling absence of conventional remorse. She was 19 years old at the time of her arrest. A psychiatric evaluation was conducted. Falling had described auditory hallucinations as a motivating factor, but evaluators determined she was competent to stand trial and did not meet the legal definition of insanity. Rather than proceed to a capital trial with unpredictable outcomes, prosecutors and defense counsel reached an agreement. Falling pleaded guilty in December of 1982 to 3 counts of first-degree murder, those of Cassidy Johnson, Jennifer Daniels, and Travis Coleman. In exchange, the state did not pursue the death penalty and did not bring charges related to the deaths of Jeffrey Davis, Joseph Spring, or an elderly man named William Swindle, who had died on the first day Falling worked as his caregiver. She received 3 concurrent life sentences. The plea agreement was criticized sharply then and has been criticized consistently since. The deal produced certainty, guilty pleas, closed cases, families spared a trial, but it also produced an outcome that many felt did not account for the full extent of the conduct. Parole consideration became the arena where that debate continued. When she became eligible after 25 years, she was denied. At a hearing in 2017, the parole board set a presumptive release date of 22/54. No supporters attended the hearing. Prosecutors argued that the crimes, committed against the most defenseless possible victims by someone they had trusted with their care, represented some of the most serious conduct the state had encountered. Falling remains incarcerated at Lowell Correctional Institution in Ocala, with no realistic prospect of release. What this case does not allow anyone to set aside is the question of what an earlier reckoning might have prevented.
The deaths of Jeffrey Davis and Joseph Spring came after investigators had already noted concerns in the Cassidy Johnson case. The death of Jennifer Daniels came after that. Each loss was framed in real time as a medical tragedy rather than a crime. Each framing created the space in which the next loss became possible. The forensic tools of the early 1980s were limited, and small communities are not naturally inclined to suspect the worst of their neighbors. But the cumulative cost of that reluctance was measured in the lives of children who had been placed in someone's care and trusted to be kept safe. Case 3. Tina Brown. This is the gripping and deeply troubling story of a Florida woman whose conflict with a young neighbor escalated into something so extreme, so deliberate, and so irreversible that a jury needed only 1 hour to reach their verdict, and then voted unanimously to recommend the harshest sentence the state allows. As of today, she remains the only woman sitting on Florida's death row. Most people understand anger. They understand the flare of it, the way a perceived injustice can send a hot current through a person's chest and make the rational mind temporarily unavailable. What most people do not understand, what most people have never come close to approaching, is the place where anger stops being a feeling and becomes a plan, where it is no longer about the moment of the offense, but about what happens next, how it happens, and who is there to see it. Tina Lasagna Brown crossed into that territory in March of 2010 in the Ensley area of Escambia County, Florida. What she and the others around her did to a 19-year-old mother of 2 named Adriana Radon Zimmerman was not the product of a single uncontrolled moment. Prosecutors established that it was decided in advance, that it was organized, that a 13-year-old girl in the neighborhood had been told what was going to happen before it happened. She was 39 years old when the crime occurred on March 24, 2010. Her victim was Adriana Radon Zimmerman, a 19-year-old mother of 2 who lived nearby and knew her attacker personally. The details of what happened to Zimmerman that night, and the fact that she was still alive long enough to name every person responsible, became the defining controversy of the case. We ranked Tina Brown at number 3 because her case is the only active death sentence among all 7 women on this list, making it, in the eyes of the Florida courts, the most unresolved and the most pressing. But what kind of conflict could really push Tina Brown to attack her young neighbor? Let's find out. Tina Brown was born on July 19, 1970. Her background, as presented during the penalty phase of her trial, included a childhood marked by neglect, abandonment, exposure to violence, poverty, and early access to substances that shaped the trajectory of her adult life. Her defense attorneys presented this history in the hope that it would be treated as meaningful mitigation. The court found it carried some weight, but not enough to alter the fundamental calculus of what had been done. Brown, her 16-year-old daughter Brittany Miller, and a neighbor named Heather Trenee Lee lived in neighboring trailers in the Ensley community. Adriana Zimmerman was also a neighbor, 19 years old, a young mother with 2 children, known to everyone in that small social world. The conflict between Zimmerman and the Brown family had a particular origin, a prior dispute involving Brittany Miller and a stun gun that Zimmerman had allegedly used or threatened to use. In the world of the Ensley trailer community, this was not a minor slight. It was the kind of thing that generated ongoing resentment, the kind of thing that could be talked about in low tones and built up into something that it did not start out being. By the evening of March 24, 2010, it had been built up significantly. Zimmerman was invited to Brown's trailer under the suggestion that the conflict between them would be addressed and resolved. This invitation was a setup. Evidence presented at trial included testimony that Brittany Miller told a 13-year-old acquaintance named Mallory Azriel shortly before Zimmerman arrived that they were about to end her life. The invitation was not about peace. It was about drawing Zimmerman into a controlled space where she could not leave on her own terms. Once inside the trailer, the assault began. Zimmerman was restrained. A stun gun, one she had owned herself, was used on her repeatedly, causing her to lose muscular control. Brown and the others continued even after she was on the ground. A crowbar was used. Zimmerman was gagged with a sock to prevent her from being heard by anyone outside. She was then forced into the trunk of Brown's car. This, the planning, the invitation, the gagging, the forced transportation, is what the court later identified as kidnapping, one of the key aggravating factors that shaped the sentencing. They drove to a wooded area. There, after removing Zimmerman from the trunk and continuing the assault, Brown retrieved a container of gasoline from the vehicle. She poured it over Zimmerman, who was still conscious. She then set her on fire. Brittany Miller reportedly reacted with apparent joy as the flames took hold. The group left the scene together and returned to the neighborhood they had come from. They left Zimmerman behind in the woods. Adriana Zimmerman did not die immediately. She was badly injured and suffering from severe thermal trauma, but she was alive. She got to her feet. She walked nearly a third of a mile through the darkness before she found help. Before she lost consciousness for the last time, she told law enforcement exactly who had done this to her. She named all three of them. She died on April 9, 2010, 16 days after the attack, from multiple thermal injuries. She was 19 years old. Her two children were left without a mother. At trial in June of 2012, the jury deliberated for approximately 1 hour before returning a guilty verdict of first-degree premeditated murder. The penalty phase produced a unanimous recommendation of death, 12-0. On September 28, 2012, Judge Gary Burgosh sentenced Brown to death, citing 3 aggravating factors that he gave significant weight: the kidnapping of the victim, the heinous and atrocious nature of the crime, and evidence that the act was cold, calculated, and premeditated. Mitigating factors from her troubled background were acknowledged but found insufficient to overweigh the gravity of what had been done. Post-conviction proceedings produced a series of challenges, including claims of juror bias, ineffective counsel, and newly discovered evidence suggesting that Heather Lee, who had cooperated with prosecutors and received a 25-year sentence for second-degree murder, had minimized her own role. Courts reviewed these claims, including the Florida Supreme Court on direct appeal in 2014, and found none that warranted overturning the verdict or the sentence. As of recent reporting in 2025 and 2026, Tina Brown remains the only woman on Florida's death row, housed at Lowell Correctional Institution Annex. No execution date has been set. The Tina Brown case is not difficult to understand on a legal level. The evidence was substantial, the jury was unanimous, and the appeals courts have consistently upheld what the trial court decided. What it is harder to understand is the decision-making process that preceded it, the moment at which a dispute between neighbors in a Florida trailer park was transformed into something that required weeks of planning and ended in the deliberate ending of a young mother's life. Adriana Zimmerman was 22 when she died. She told her killers' names to the first person who found her. That is who she was. Someone still fighting for accountability even when she had almost nothing left to fight with.
Case 4. Aileen Wuornos. This is the account of a woman whose name became one of the most recognized in American criminal history. A Florida drifter who, over the course of roughly 12 months along the highways of Central Florida, ended the lives of 7 men. She did not deny it. What she disputed, passionately, publicly, and until her final day, was the reason. Florida's highways have a particular quality in the early morning hours, long and flat and almost entirely empty, the kind of emptiness that feels different when you were standing at the edge of one rather than driving through it. For years in the late 1980s and into 1990, a woman named Aileen Wuornos worked those roads in Central Florida, and the men who stopped for her were entering a situation they did not understand. She was later identified as one of the few women in American criminal history to have committed a series of killings in the manner typically associated with this category of crime. Law enforcement eventually connected her to the deaths of 7 men across a span of roughly 12 months. Her case raised questions about trauma, about survival, about what the legal system is designed to do and for whom, that courts, journalists, and ordinary people have not finished arguing about in the decades since. Aileen Wuornos was 33 years old when the killings began, and 36 at the time of her conviction. A detail that emerged after the trial about Mallory's own criminal history became one of the most discussed controversies the case ever produced.
We ranked Aileen Wuornos at number 4 because no woman on this list is more widely known, more debated, or more complicated to reduce to a single verdict, and that complexity alone earns this position on the list. What was really happening on those Florida highways? Let's find out. Aileen Carroll Wuornos was born on February 29, 1956 in Rochester, Michigan, into a family that disintegrated almost immediately. Her father, who was incarcerated for crimes against a child and never met her, took his own life in prison. Her mother abandoned Aileen and her brother Keith when Aileen was approximately 4 years old. The children were raised by their maternal grandparents, who concealed the true nature of the relationship from them until Aileen was 12. She grew up in an environment she would later describe as involving severe physical mistreatment and abuse at the hands of her alcoholic grandfather. By her early teenage years, she was living without stable housing, surviving as best she could, and had experienced a pregnancy after being assaulted. The child was placed for adoption. She dropped out of school and left Michigan entirely, gravitating toward Florida's highway communities as a young adult. By her early 30s, Wuornos was living in Florida, moving between counties, working as a roadside prostitute to survive. In 1986, she met a woman named Tyria Moore at a Daytona Beach bar. They became partners and lived together for approximately 4.5 years, with Wuornos continuing to work the highways while Moore held low-paying jobs. Their relationship was defined by heavy drinking, financial instability, and the kind of mutual dependence that tends to form between people with very few other options. Wuornos carried a .22 caliber pistol, which she described as protection. She carried deep distrust of men, rooted in a lifetime of documented abuse and exploitation. The killings began in late 1989. Richard Mallory, a 51-year-old electronics repairman from Clearwater, picked Wuornos up and drove with her to a wooded area near Daytona Beach. She later said that he became violent and assaulted her, and that she fired her weapon in response.
He was struck multiple times and left in the woods beneath a piece of carpet. His body was found on December 13, 1989. Over the following 12 months, 6 more men were found dead in wooded locations across central Florida counties. David Spears, Charles Karskeden, Peter Seams, whose body was never recovered, Troy Burris, Charles Humphreys, and Walter Gino Antonio. Each was a middle-aged man. Each had been shot with a small caliber weapon. Each had been encountered, authorities concluded, on or near a Florida highway. After each death, Wuornos took cash, personal items, and often the victim's vehicle, some of which were later pawned, generating receipts that carried her fingerprints. Wuornos and Moore were identified through a combination of witnesses, pawn shop records linking them to items belonging to victims, and fingerprint evidence. Moore was taken into custody first. Offered immunity in exchange for cooperation, she agreed. Under guidance from investigators, Moore made recorded telephone calls to Wuornos from a motel room, encouraging her to confess, protecting Moore from any accomplice exposure in the process. On January 9, 1991, Wuornos was arrested at the Last Resort Bar in Port Orange. She gave a recorded confession to 6 of the 7 killings, stating in each instance that she had acted in self-defense after the men became violent. She was the only suspect ever charged. Her trial in 1992 covered only the Richard Mallory case. Wuornos testified on her own behalf, describing what she said had happened in the woods and insisting that every encounter had turned dangerous before she fired. The jury was unconvinced. They deliberated for less than 2 hours and returned a verdict of guilty on first-degree murder and armed robbery. The death recommendation was unanimous. She later entered no contest or guilty pleas in the remaining cases and received additional death sentences without full trials for most. Post-conviction, it emerged that Mallory had prior convictions related to a serious offense involving a woman, information that supporters argued should have been fully explored at trial as potential corroboration of Wuornos's account. She dismissed attorneys at various points, waived certain appeals, and expressed what appeared to be an active desire for execution rather than continued confinement. Mental health professionals testified to diagnoses of borderline and antisocial personality disorder. Competency became a subject of legal debate. She was adopted from prison by a woman who claimed a spiritual calling toward her.
On October 9, 2002, Aileen Wuornos was executed by lethal injection at Florida State Prison. She was 46 years old and had spent more than a decade on death row. She was the second woman executed in Florida in the modern era. She declined a special last meal. Her final statement referenced beliefs about what awaited her and was described by witnesses as disjointed. She died at 9:47 in the morning. What the Wuornos case continues to resist is a clean resolution. The 7 men she killed are dead, and none of them chose the circumstances that ended their lives. She is also a woman whose life, from its very beginning, contained almost nothing that resembled safety or care. The legal system treated those two realities as separate. Courts have consistently held that a difficult history does not produce a legal defense. What courts cannot settle, what no verdict ever fully settles, is whether the category of self-defense applied to the circumstances of those Florida roadside encounters, and whether the person best positioned to answer that question was ever given a fair opportunity to be heard. If you enjoy videos like this, please remember to like this video and subscribe to our channel.
Case 5. Amelia Carr. This is the disturbing account of a young Florida woman who was nearly 8 months pregnant when she participated in the planning and execution of a murder, a crime born out of jealousy, romantic entanglement, and a desire to permanently remove the one person she believed stood between her and the future she wanted. The fact that she was carrying a child at the time makes this case almost impossible to process. There is a particular kind of destruction that jealousy can produce when it is left to run long enough without interruption. Not the sharp, immediate jealousy of a single moment, but the sustained, calculating kind that sits with a grievance over weeks and months, and eventually stops asking whether its conclusions are reasonable. And in February of 29, in the rural community of Boardman in Marion County, Florida, that kind of jealousy reached its end point. Amelia Carr was 24 years old when the crime occurred, and 26 at the time of her conviction. Her victim was Heather Strong, 26 years old, a mother of 2, the estranged wife of Carr's boyfriend, who was lured to an isolated location in Boardman, Marion County, on February 15, 29. The sentencing that followed produced a controversy that reached all the way to the United States Supreme Court. We ranked Amelia Carr at number 5 because her case sits at a rare intersection of domestic obsession, legal landmark, and a question about culpability that Florida courts spent over a decade trying to resolve. What truly drove Amelia Carr to this point? Let's jump into the details. Amelia Lily Carr was nearly 8 months pregnant. The father of her unborn child was a man named Joshua Fulgham, and the woman standing between them, not romantically, not anymore, but legally and parentally and in the permanent way that shared children create, was Heather Strong, Fulgham's estranged wife. Heather Strong was 26 years old and the mother of Fulgham's 2 existing children. Amelia Carr and Joshua Fulgham were a couple in the specific kind of chaos that forms between people who both have significant unresolved issues and a shared capacity for poor decision-making under pressure. Fulgham had a history of conflict with Heather Strong during their marriage, including at least one incident involving a firearm that had led to his incarceration. Heather Strong, working at a local restaurant and living separately, continued to be present in their lives through the children. Carr, who was significantly younger and newly pregnant with Fulgham's child, appears to have experienced Heather Strong's continued existence in their orbit not as an inconvenience, but as an intolerable threat. In January of 29, approximately a month before Heather Strong died, Carr allegedly confronted her with a knife and demanded she sign documents or drop criminal charges against Fulgham, an act prosecutors later used to establish a pattern of coercion and escalating intent. The location selected for what happened in February of 29 was a storage trailer on the property behind Carr's mother's home in Boardman, an isolated structure in a rural setting, chosen, prosecutors argued, specifically because it offered privacy. Heather Strong was drawn to the location under pretexts involving the children or the ongoing disputes between the parties. What met her there was not a conversation. She was physically restrained using duct tape and secured to a computer chair. An attempt was made to end her life by force, targeting the neck, which failed.
Heather Strong struggled and briefly broke free before being subdued again, this time with a flashlight that Carr later admitted to using.
Fulgham then further restrained her. The two then placed a plastic bag over Heather Strong's head and held it there until she stopped breathing. She died from asphyxiation. She was 26 years old. Both Carr and Fulgham later gave detailed statements to detectives describing the sequence of events inside that trailer, each account shifting blame toward the other while confirming the core facts. A recorded conversation between Carr and Fulgham's sister, obtained separately, further implicated Carr in explicit terms. After the killing, the body was buried on or near the property. Fulgham told police for weeks that Heather Strong had simply disappeared, that she had dropped the children off and left. On March 18, 2009, after investigators maintained pressure and confronted him with inconsistencies, Fulgham led authorities to the burial site. The remains were recovered the following day. Heather Strong had been missing for 32 days. Amelia Carr went to trial in December of 2010. She was convicted by the jury of first-degree murder and kidnapping after brief deliberations. In the penalty phase, the jury voted 7-5, recommending death, a non-unanimous result under the Florida sentencing framework then in place. Judge Willard Pope sentenced her to death by lethal injection on February 22, 2011, citing the kidnapping, the heinous and cruel nature of the crime, and evidence of cold, calculated premeditation. Carr was 26 at sentencing. She became one of the few women on Florida's death row and, for a time, its youngest. Joshua Fulgham went to trial separately in 2012. He pleaded guilty. His jury, in a separate proceeding with separate dynamics and a separate plea agreement, voted 8-4, recommending life. He received 2 consecutive life sentences. The contrast between the two outcomes became one of the central controversies in post-conviction proceedings. Defense attorneys for Carr argued persistently that Fulgham, the estranged husband with a documented history of violence toward Heather Strong and arguably the more direct actor in the killing, had received a substantially lesser sentence than the woman who, by some accounts, played a secondary role. Courts reviewed this argument without reversing the outcome. The decisive change came from the U.S. Supreme Court in 2016. In Hurst v. Florida, the court ruled that Florida's capital sentencing scheme, which allowed death sentences to be imposed based on non-unanimous jury recommendations, violated constitutional guarantees regarding jury fact-finding. The ruling invalidated dozens of Florida death sentences, including Carr's. In 2017, rather than retry the penalty phase, prosecutors declined to pursue death again. Amelia Carr was resentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. She was 32 years old. What the Carr case raises, and what no resentencing fully resolves, is the weight that ought to be assigned to motive and planning when the person doing the planning is motivated by love in its most destructive form. Carr did not target a stranger. She targeted a woman she viewed as an obstacle to the future she had decided she deserved. She was 8 months pregnant when it happened. She was building something, or believed she was, and she concluded that building it required removing a person from the world. Heather Strong had 2 children who grew up without a mother because of that conclusion. That is the permanent record of what was decided in a storage trailer in Boardman, Florida, in February of 2009. Case 6. Virginia Larzelere. This is the riveting and deeply complex account of a Florida woman convicted of masterminding the murder of her own husband, a successful dentist, inside the very office where he treated patients every day. She has maintained her innocence from the moment of her arrest to this day, and the fact that the one person tried alongside her was acquitted has kept this case alive in public debate for decades. A dental office is one of the quieter places in community life, a place built around the small rituals of professional care, appointments kept, familiar faces at the front desk, the particular intimacy of a space where someone trusts you with something as personal as their health. Norman Larzelere was 39 years old and successful. His wife, Virginia Larzelere, worked beside him as the office manager. On March 8, 1991, at approximately 1 in the afternoon, a masked man entered the practice with a sawed-off shotgun. He moved through the office and fired. Norman Larzelere collapsed and died in his wife's arms. Virginia was on the phone with emergency services almost immediately, her voice described by witnesses as hysterical. The investigation that followed would take years, produce multiple trials, and eventually result in Virginia Larzelere spending 15 years on Florida's death row for a crime she has always claimed she did not orchestrate. Virginia Larzelere was approximately 38 years old at the time of the crime and 39 at conviction. We ranked Virginia Larzelere at number 6 because this case carries a level of legal and moral complexity involving a son's acquittal, a death sentence later vacated, and persistent claims of innocence that no other case on this list can match. What was really happening behind the walls of that dental practice? Let's jump in. Virginia's personal history was layered, and by the time it was fully examined in post-conviction proceedings, considerably more complicated than it appeared during the original trial. She had been married multiple times before Norman. He was her 4th husband. Norman, a successful professional with a substantial insurance portfolio, had adopted Virginia's son Jason. The couple's working relationship inside the dental practice meant they spent most of their time together, which gave Virginia detailed knowledge of the business, the schedule, and the financial arrangements attached to Norman's life. Those financial arrangements, prosecutors would establish, totaled approximately $2.1 million in life insurance payable upon his death. The state's theory was that Virginia had not acted alone or spontaneously. Rather, she had spent a period of time before March of 1991 approaching multiple people, including her son Jason, then 18, and acquaintances, including Stephen Heidel and Kristen Palmieri, with a request and an offer of payment. The request was the death of her husband. Witnesses testified to these conversations during her trial, describing Virginia as the driving force behind the conspiracy, the one who identified the need, framed the plan, and arranged the participants. The masked gunman who entered the office that afternoon carried out the physical act, but the prosecution's case rested on establishing that he was there because Virginia put him there. Investigators moved away from the robbery theory early. The shooting had the characteristics of a targeted act rather than an interrupted theft. The speed of it, the single decisive shot, the quick exit.
Virginia's arrest came approximately 2 months after the killing, on May 4, 1991, as she was preparing to leave town carrying cash and gold. Jason turned himself in. Key witnesses, Palmieri and Heidel, testified under immunity agreements describing the conspiracy. A detective testified in pre-trial proceedings to an observation about Virginia's behavior immediately after the shooting, specifically actions she allegedly took near Norman's body that prosecutors used to suggest she was ensuring he could not speak before help arrived. She denied this account entirely. In 1992, a Volusia County jury convicted Virginia of first-degree murder. The jury recommended death, and on May 11, 1993, she was sentenced to it. She spent 15 years on Florida's death row, at times the only woman there. Her son Jason, tried separately in Polk County after a venue change necessitated by pretrial publicity, was acquitted by a different jury evaluating the same basic constellation of evidence. The contrast was significant and became a persistent element of the debate about whether Virginia's conviction rested on reliable foundations. Post-conviction proceedings focused heavily on her trial attorney, Jack Wilkins. Appeals documented alleged severe substance dependency during the period of representation, including cocaine and alcohol, along with financial irregularities and later federal convictions for tax fraud and perjury. At the penalty phase, no mitigation witnesses were presented. Virginia's family history, including alleged childhood sexual abuse affecting multiple members of her family, was not investigated or raised. The Florida Supreme Court, reviewing the case in 2008, found this constituted ineffective assistance of counsel at the penalty phase. The death sentence was vacated. Virginia was resentenced to life in prison and remains incarcerated. She maintained innocence through every stage of the case and in interviews conducted years into her incarceration. Her supporters have argued consistently that the conviction rested on the word of co-conspirators who were themselves deeply involved in the crime and whose testimony was shaped by favorable deals with the prosecution. Critics of her position note that the Florida Supreme Court affirmed the conviction itself, only the death sentence was set aside, meaning the determination of her guilt was reviewed and upheld. The two things can both be true, that she was convicted by a valid process, and that the person primarily responsible for her penalty phase representation was not in a condition to represent anyone adequately. What the Virginia Larzelere case illustrates more than most is the fragility of outcomes that rest heavily on witness testimony from participants in the same alleged conspiracy. Heidel and Palmieri were inside the events they described. Jason, who was charged alongside his mother, was acquitted. The masked gunman's identity remained a subject of contested testimony rather than unambiguous physical evidence. Norman Larzelere died in his own office, in the building he had built his professional life around, shot while fleeing through the space where he treated patients. He was 39 years old. Whatever the full truth of the conspiracy behind that afternoon, he is its most clearly established victim, and his death remains the fixed point around which every subsequent legal argument has revolved.
Case 7. Tiffany Ann Cole. This is the heartbreaking and profoundly disturbing account of a young Florida woman who helped plan and carry out the murder of an elderly couple who had once been genuinely kind to her, people who trusted her, recognized her face, and had no reason to fear her presence at their door. The method chosen for their deaths was so deliberate, so specific in its cruelty, that the grave intended for the victims was dug 2 full days before they were placed in it. There are people in the world who are kind to someone they do not need to be kind to, who help without being asked, who extend themselves toward strangers or toward people who drift into their lives without expectation of return. Reggie and Carol Sumner were that kind of people. The couple, both 61 years old and in declining health, had been kind to Tiffany Cole when their paths crossed in South Carolina. They had sold her a car. They had treated her like someone worth treating decently. When Tiffany Cole moved into their orbit again in Jacksonville, Florida in '25, Reggie and Carol Sumners recognized a familiar face. What they did not recognize, what they had no reason to suspect, was that their kindness had given Tiffany Cole and the people around her detailed knowledge of who they were, what they had, where they lived, and how easily they might be taken advantage of. The crime that followed was planned in advance, executed across state lines, and ended in a manner that a jury in Jacksonville would later describe as among the most disturbing they had encountered. Tiffany Cole was 23 years old when the crime occurred, and approximately 25 at the time of her conviction. The question of how much she was truly responsible for, compared to those around her, became one of the longest-running debates in this entire case. We ranked Tiffany Ann Cole at number 7, the final case on this list, because the premeditation involved, the betrayal of people who had shown her nothing but decency, and the method by which Reggie and Carol Sumner died makes this the most difficult story on the list to sit with. What could possibly justify what Tiffany Ann Cole helped set in motion? Let's find out. Tiffany Ann Cole was born on December 3, 1981. She was 23 years old and 25, living in Florida and in a relationship with a man named Michael Jackson. Jackson had been in contact with the Sumners. The elderly couple had allowed him to stay with them at their Jacksonville home and had observed their circumstances closely. The Sumners had recently sold their South Carolina home and received approximately $90,000 from the transaction. They were frail, they lived quietly, they knew Cole and trusted her by extension. Jackson shared what he had seen with Cole and with 2 other men, Alan Wade and 18-year-old Bruce Nixon. The 4 of them developed a plan that centered on taking the Sumners' money by taking the Sumners. 2 days before the night of July 8, 25, Cole, Jackson, and Wade drove to a remote, wooded area of Charlton County, Georgia, approximately 30 miles from the Sumners' Jacksonville home, and dug a grave. They dug it to a depth of 6 feet and then left it waiting. The fact of that grave, the premeditation it represents, the deliberateness of returning to Jacksonville afterward and carrying through with the rest of the plan, is what prosecutors would later emphasize most. This was not a crime that escalated from something that started as something else. The grave was dug first. Everything else followed from that decision.
On the night of July 8th, the group went to the Sumners' home. They gained entry. Accounts vary on the exact method, with some indicating they were let in by the couple who recognized Cole. Once inside, Reggie and Carol Sumner were bound with duct tape.
They were robbed of their ATM cards and forced, still alive and restrained, into the trunk of their own Lincoln Town Car. Wade and Nixon drove the Lincoln toward Georgia. Cole and Jackson followed in a Mazda. The vehicles traveled to the pre-prepared site in Charlton County. At the grave site, the Sumners were removed from the vehicle. Jackson wrote down their PIN codes on a yellow notepad after they were coerced into providing them. Still bound, the couple was placed into the grave they did not know had been dug for them 2 days earlier. Nixon returned to the road where Cole waited in the Mazda. Wade and Jackson remained to fill in the grave. Jackson later told investigators he could hear Carol Sumner's voice as the dirt covered her. The medical examiner who reviewed the case confirmed that the cause of death for both Reggie and Carol Sumner was suffocation. Afterward, the group used the stolen ATM cards. Photographs taken of the perpetrators in the period following the crime were later described by victim family members and prosecutors as deeply disturbing in what they communicated about the group's state of mind. The bodies were not discovered by investigators on their own. Bruce Nixon, who had cooperated with police after his arrest, led authorities to the burial site. His cooperation was reflected in his sentence, a plea to second-degree murder and a term of 45 to 55 years, substantially less than what the others received. At Cole's trial in 2007, the jury convicted her on all counts, 2 counts each of first-degree murder, kidnapping, and robbery. At the penalty phase, the jury voted 9-3 recommending death. In March of 2008, she was sentenced to death. The court identified multiple aggravating factors: the heinous and atrocious nature of the killing, the commission during a robbery and kidnapping, and the specific intent to avoid identification by eliminating the only people who could provide it. Cole's defense argued throughout that her role was peripheral, that she had not personally interacted with the victims at the gravesite, had not placed them in the ground, had remained by the road while others completed the physical act. Prosecutors responded that she was the catalyst, the person whose prior relationship with the Sumners made the targeting possible, whose knowledge of their circumstances made the plan viable, and whose participation in every stage, including the pre-dug grave, made her as responsible as anyone present. This disagreement about relative culpability shaped the resentencing that eventually followed. The 2016 U.S. Supreme Court ruling in Hurst v. Florida, invalidating non-unanimous death recommendations in Florida capital cases, triggered resentencing proceedings for Cole, as it did for dozens of Florida inmates. Her resentencing was scheduled for August of 2023. After hearing evidence that included photographs from the scene and statements from victim family members, a new jury deliberated for approximately 3 hours and voted 10-2 for life without parole rather than death. She was resentenced to life in prison. Members of the Sumner family, who had earlier supported the death recommendation, expressed forgiveness towards Cole at the conclusion of the resentencing, an act of grace that stood in sharp contrast to the deliberateness of what had been done to their loved ones.
Reggie and Carol Sumner were 61 years old and unwell and living quietly in Jacksonville when Tiffany Cole walked back into their lives. They had no way of knowing what she had already put in place before she arrived. The grave in the Georgia woods had been waiting for them since 2 days earlier. It is that detail, the pre-dug grave, the gap between its preparation and the night the Sumners were placed inside it, that the legal record has never been able to move past. Tiffany Cole is serving life in prison without parole. The Sumners are gone. Their kindness, which should have been a strength, turned out to be the thing that made them visible to people who were looking for a target. Thanks for watching. Check out other videos on this channel for more cases of the most dangerous men and women America has ever witnessed.